This is the third and final video for Chapter 23 on natural selection. I've already done the Hardy-Weinberg, and then we went over the video 2 was over genetic drift, founder effect, bottleneck effect, genetic flow. So in this video, I'll be talking about the relative fitness of the whole organism. So natural selection can affect frequency distributions in three big ways. And if you follow along with the notes that I have included in a separate assignment here, and if you take a look at the textbook at the same time, it's going to be a little bit easier, I think, for you to follow along, and especially when you're looking at the pictures of the three different distribution populations. They are directionals, disruptive, and stabilized. So in directional, they tend to favor individuals exhibiting one extreme characteristic. And one of the better examples of that was in the previous video. I talked about two American scientists who had gone to the Galapagos Islands, and they had done research for a couple of years there, and when they had a drought, and they studied the populations of the finches over that drought period. And one of the things that they discovered was that the very small finched beaked birds and the very large beaked birds, neither one of them had a distinct advantage under the drought conditions because there weren't a lot of tiny seeds and there weren't a lot of big seeds. Trees tend to, when they're in a drought, is that they drop their leaves as an evolutionary savior piece, because then they're not wasting energy for photosynthesis, and they also stop producing seeds. So if the drought lasts a few years, the seed population will be way down, and then the population of food for organisms is down, and then it really gets to be survival of the fittest. And so those medium-sized beaked birds had a tendency to be able to find enough food available for them. And so then our second, if you look at the curve, and it's starting on page, I believe it's 499, I'll double check for you, 477. If you check on page, that was actually the previous one, it is 481. 481 shows you the three types of the graphs, the directional and the disruptive and the stabilizing. So in that middle graph with the disruptive, both extremes, it's the opposite, both extremes benefit from that. And the textbook gives an example that I hadn't been familiar with, and I did look it up, the black-bellied seed crackers of Cameroon. And they have a the medium-sized birds, in that when that was going under extreme conditions, medium-sized birds didn't have that good of a chance. Instead, they didn't have a lot of medium-sized seeds on Cameroon. They had either very large or very small, and so it was the two extremes only that really did well under those conditions. And then your third little graph that they give you is one that really applies best to human population prior to, what we consider to be our really modern day medical care. And so that it's the medium-sized children do best. Extreme, either the one extreme or the other didn't do very well. And so I did put down in your notes that one example of that was in my lifetime. I was very young, of course, but in my lifetime, President Kennedy, just prior to his assassination, had his third child, Patrick. And Patrick was a slight preemie. I say slight preemie because in modern day now, when you think of some children survive even at 6 months, that Patrick wasn't all that preemie, but he was a low birth weight baby, and he did not survive. The president's child in the 1960s did not survive being a low birth weight baby. So that's one extreme. And then the other is that for all of you that were C-section babies, you would not have probably survived prior to 1950s. I included had a 10-pound baby, and so I definitely would have died in childbirth, and the baby would have died as well. So those are the two extremes. This is where that medium-sized individual has a better chance of survival. And then the chapter goes on page 482, talking about sexual selection, and that has that has a component to natural selection. So one is sexual dimorphism in birds, and where most of you know that I'm up in Maine, sitting on the water as I do most of my lessons. I have mallards and wood ducks, very common waterfowl in New England, and in both cases the male is extremely colorful. The wood duck has a dark green neck and a purple feathers along the side of that, and the mallard as well is colored. And so that's not only a natural selection component, but it's a camouflage and defense mechanism. The female in sexual dimorphism is usually much easier camouflaged in their natural environment, and there is thought to be this evolutionary component where the more colorful male can attract predators, and the goal would be for them to leave the nest and during breeding season and attract that predator. In fact, there's even some birds that have like a game play to it, where the male will be able to drag a wing, pretending that it has like a broken wing to start to pull off the predator. So in sexual dimorphism, we have two very different colored organisms. And if you think about going to York Animal Kingdom there, and there's peacocks everywhere, the more brightly colored fans of those male peacocks, the birds that have an ability to have more of a colorful ability, tend to be the ones that the females tend to go after. Or the male can frighten away other males with their wide fan, and then reduce the population a little bit as to what their competitor will be like. And you see that in lions as well, where there'll be the male lion who is aging will be during breeding season will be attacked by the younger male lion, and whoever wins gets the pride of females. And then we also have intersexual selection as well, where there's a mate choice, and so it can work both ways. Text talks about the females being more attracted to certain species. I know in the honors CP, I showed the video of the blue-footed booby who does a specific mating dance, and then shows that how it's picking up debris, and it can make a nest. And well, if the female doesn't think he's making all that well of a nest, or is not going to be able to really fend for her, she walks off, and the whole mating dance starts over again when he finds another potential mate. And if you observe flocks, especially of birds, because they're so readily available, especially during mating season, there oftentimes are entire groups of males that are flocking towards one female. And so again, in the bird population, it's not uncommon to have multiple fertilization attempts. And we have put in this week into Google Classroom for the honors option a piece that goes along with this chapter on the preservation of genetic variation. And it has to do with tree frogs. And there was a study done, and I often wonder about these scientists, because you think about them studying for several years out in the woods. In this example, they were studying the calls of tree frogs. And there is quite a variation in the tree frog call, and the case study is based off of, does the duration of call to the female aid at all in reproduction? Is there any greater rate of the male frog that has the longer call? Are they actually more reproductively fit? And so that's the case study that's not due until after vacation, but it goes with this chapter. And I think you'll find it a little bit on the interesting side. And they also talk about a balancing act in variation, in that sometimes just because we are in eukaryotic cells, we are diploid, we have two different alleles, that gives us an advantage in that there are characteristics we're getting from two different parents, and the ability for a species to naturally evolve due to alterations of those alleles is greater. All we need is one mutation, and if it's a positive one, again, then that species might have that slight advantage. And again, that would be with the peppered moth of England, where it was white and speckled prior to the Industrial Revolution. And then as the Industrial Revolution happened, the smog of the air was quite thick. And what happened is that the trees would be coated with this soot, and the moths that were naturally just a little bit darker had a better chance of survival and being able to produce more young. And so if you looked at the moth collections in some of the museums in England, you can actually see decades-long evolution of white speckled moth to a darker speckled moth. And then after their Clean Air Act, which was much sooner than the US's, it goes back to that white and speckled moth again. And you have to kind of wonder, with air pollution right now being reduced, that they're even having more of an advantage. The other part that goes along with that diploid is, and the balancing act, is a heterozygous advantage, in that sometimes organisms will inherit a trait that may not at first think that that's all such a great trait. So the textbook talks about sickle cell anemia right here, and I'm often kind of surprised about why they bring it up. It's almost as if the author is not aware of what shortened lifespan people with sickle cell anemia have. Generally, they only survive until their late 20s, early 30s. If they're very lucky health-wise, maybe early 40s. That's not the case in most rural areas of Africa, where the death rate is usually much, much younger than that. In fact, the National Institute of Health is they started a trial a few years ago, taking people with sickle cell before too much damage is done in their early 20s, and trying to give them, killing off all of their bone marrow like you would do for a person with leukemia, and then giving them a bone marrow transplant. And so far, that has been somewhat successful. They never kill off all of the bone marrow. There's always the risk of a person's own stem cells recreating what they were trying to fix to begin with. But in the textbook, they're saying, okay, you inherited sickle cell anemia. That's not great. But the advantage is, because of that the blood chemistry change, malaria doesn't have any effect on them. So, yay, they don't get malaria, but their lifespan is shortened. So again, there are circumstances where that heterozygote advantage is definitely positive in a population. I'm just not sure that the textbook used the best example they probably could. So this is really the overview of chapter 23. It's really pretty interesting when you think about natural selection, and most of this, a lot of this were concepts when DNA replication and having to go gene to a protein. There was an awful lot of work you had to do to learn the concepts. This is really an awful lot of common sense. So try to use the notes that I sent out to you along with the screencast videos, and go along with your textbook to be able to make sure that you grasp the concepts. And remember, I'm only an email away. I know that you've said the Google Meets are not quite as good teaching-wise as the screencast, but I still want to be able to meet in with you and make sure that if there's any concepts you're not quite sure about, that we can make sure that they're clear. So again, have a good vacation, and that case study is not due until after vacation. Thank you.